Tonight's topic, I've titled it Identity and Role Confusion. I probably could have, the more provocative would be gender, sexuality, identity. I think it surprised me, but since we've started this group, I've probably run about 40% of the young people who are struggling with some kind of gender or sexuality issue. It is not what we're a group for. We're not trying to change, but it really interferes with a lot of other stuff. And so for a couple of years now, I've tried to figure out how to talk about it. So this is kind of my first attempt publicly to talk about it in any kind of meaningful way. And I made sure I did a focus group with some young people to get their thoughts on some of these things. So you're getting some input there. So just set things up with that. I will talk for about 20, 30 minutes and answer questions, and then we'll go into our kind of our normal support thing. And so I'll share some of their thoughts as they go, but always like to throw what we do in there, though most of you know it. So there's a good article out there, like, what has COVID done? And COVID is by no stretch of the imagination the only piece of this identity thing, but all of you young people have now, during a pretty important period of identity growth, had a year that was just unlike any other, and so the research right now is, or the experts, because we don't really have enough great research, is that it's made kids feel like they don't have much control over their lives. And we in the group have seen, like, somehow school and the stability of life mitigated like a divorced family, some of the issues that were there, and the kids still had enough stability, but we have seen such an increase in divorce. Like, they're now all the time in one of those two houses. It's all there and present. So just in that case, we've seen more young people differently of divorce. And COVID, the developmental process has been interfered with, and that's really the biggest thing that applies to this whole identity crisis, is that a year where things, like, we have no normal. Like, so none of us knew how to have a role during that time period for the most part, to some extent. And so when you think about it, even an 18-year-old, you're still talking an 18th of their life. It's still a significant number, as opposed to, I'm 50, it's a 50th of my life, and my life didn't slow down much during COVID. So and I'm well along my identity path. It changes a little bit, or it grows or something, but it's not in a shaping phase. I'm not creating brand new pieces of whatever. And so the trajectory was changed. Kids look into the future, they're not looking at one that wasn't pictured before. I really, and it'll play out, but this feels to me like a Depression era thing. And we all know the kind of the facts of our grandparents who, lived through Depression, and just, it really framed the rest of their lives. Why are you keeping every one of those plastic spoons, Grandma? Like, it just did. Like, there might be a time I need this thing, and justifiably. And so I look at it, and really that whole, why should I trust that prom's going to be there? Why should I have confidence that I'll even get to play ball this year? Like, yeah, as it comes up, but I may as well just enjoy this moment. I think that's been the biggest, like, the only thing I got anything control over is right now in this space in here. So it ended up being the kind of pain that was easy to self-medicate, direct distraction or drugs. And regardless of vaccination, there's just some emotional blowback. So I just frame that in that it impacted identity. Everything else is kind of still the same over a long period of time, but I think we've had more drastic shifts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, except for I'm basing most of tonight's thoughts on Erik Erikson, who's a pretty well-known historical psychologist, and he really looked at developmental stages. So he and Piaget and a couple more are really the core developmental people. And Erikson kind of broke life into these 6, and there's actually 8, but only 6 of them really matter to what we're doing. And when he thinks of a life stage, it is what needed to be accomplished before they could successfully go on to the next one. All right, and so, you know, basic trust versus basic mistrust, literally 0 to 1. And so this is where in adoptive cases, or when a kid goes into child welfare or something like that, if they don't get the neglect, because my older sister is adopted, and literally from the time she was 2 to today, she's had the same parents I've had. Her experience is radically different, having started those first 2 years neglected and left out, and it took her a good 40 years to kind of fill those holes in her life. And so, you know, and that's stuff that started in that first year. And so that's how it influences all the rest of them. Autonomy versus shame, finding purpose between 3 to 6. This is a really interesting, my kid, 3 of my kids are all in this phase, and I've got 2 of them that don't like school. Like they're really like not wanting that initiative phase. And then competency from 6 to 11. And then the one that matters the most is fidelity. And fidelity just, in this case, just means like, I have an identity, I have an idea of who I am, I found it, and I can stick with that through the weathering of the storms, all right? And so it's really meant to be a time, 12 to 20, questioning of self, who I am, how do I fit in, where do I go? You know, and the role confusion includes, you know, you can go back, and in the 20s, the role confusion was like, do I want to be a stay-at-home mom? And that kept shifting, and now we've gotten to a place where gender and sexuality are now part of decisions that they feel like they have to make during their adolescent years. And so we're seeing, and the problem with these is just like the trust versus mistrust is that if this doesn't get accomplished, it then influences their future, their ability to be in intimate relationships and successful relationships and move through these, you know, because you look at stage 6, which is intimacy versus isolation. Are you going to have meaningful relationships, or are you just going to choose to be isolated? And that, you know, and that kind of isolation is not necessarily just in their room kind of thing, but it's like, I'm only going to have acquaintance relationships all the way around. You know, nobody gets in too deep kind of thing. And so just to frame, these are Erikson's life stages. I have yet to find anything that disputes them heavily. You know, like there's no arguments against them, and they're still taught in all the classes on development. So that means that everybody who looks at them still thinks this is, and the research that's been done has supported them for the most part. So we take that, expand out on what's supposed to be happening between 12 and 20. They're supposed to establish an identity. They are supposed to becoming more independent and autonomous. They are practicing intimacy and close relationships. They are adjusting to a developing and changing body and adjusting to brain development. Adjusting is such a fun word. It's literally, I don't know what this sensation is right now, whether it's a young lady's body or a young man who's, you know, like I didn't know what was happening when my voice changed. And so then how does that get framed? How do they think about it? And in a time when there's 100 options instead of 2, or like how do you now interpret this feeling that I'm having? I don't feel right in my body. I got to pick one of these 50 options, you know, and so I just want to kind of show how I see this piecing into here. That brings you to the front page of your guys' packet. I would say this is probably best practice in the like this diagram made sense to the young people I talked with, and I brought in, I think 2 of them. One was bisexual, one was transgender, one was a straight but pretty significant betrayal in his life and trying to fit in the world himself, and then I literally have no idea where the other one sits, but he's completely comfortable in this world of like you can be whatever you want. And so brought them in and kind of walked them through some of this material to get their feedback and what they thought. And of the examples I showed them, this one made sense to them in how they think about gender, sexuality, and that it actually like are 6. And here's the difference from where, say, I thought about it all. Like each of the separate categories can have completely different answers. Like it's not like one answer in one category leads to what you might linearly say is the answer in the next category. So gender identity, you like, okay, I'm manness. I feel fairly towards the man side of it, but you know, I was called metrosexual in high school or not high school, but college for whatever that meant, because I like to dress nicely or whatever. It didn't mean really much of anything. And I am not out having fighting matches on the altar. So am I really full manness? You know, like where am I on that spectrum? Like I'm not out shooting things. I'm not opposed to it, but you know, what does manness mean? And the thing here is that we might have all thought that, but like we didn't have a big problem with it. Right now, these are real questions, real options for everybody. All right. So then, but I put myself somewhere on that scale of manness, and then it goes to how do I want to express it? I would say the biggest difference that I'm seeing right now is that either one of those options is okay, regardless as to where I am on the arrow of manness or femaleness. Does that make sense how I'm saying these are completely separate categories to the young people? And it's a continuum all the way across the board. And then you've got anatomical 6, you know, so what they're born with, and you know, they can quote you, like a lot of them can quote you some of the stats on it, but if you break it down, the research says that about 1 in 1,000 have some kind of gender unnormalcy, I guess. You know, so 1 in 1,000. So they start quoting facts like, so okay, so it's obvious, like, you know, that's all the various categories of deformed gender, you know, didn't have it, opposite, whatever kind of categories of actual being born with. And then you get down to the ones that are, you know, sexually attracted to, you know, are you attracted to women? Are you attracted to men? And here's where, again, you go back and I'm adjusting to a developing and changing body. Especially if you throw anything else like trauma in or anything like that, or something caused by somebody. But I'm feeling this. I happen to be near, you know, someone of the same sex who's treating me well, and opposite sex have bullied me at times in my life. You know, like, okay, maybe I am more attracted. Like it's just there's just a lot of question marks there. And that there is in this era a definite, you know, I'm sexually attracted to these people and I'm romantically attracted. Like those are now 2 separate categories. I really, really like hanging out and watching this set of movies with these people, right? So am I romantically attracted to them? It's a good question. I mean, it's a, you know, I don't know. In fact, I know I don't have meaningful opinions on this, or like even is it good or bad or anything like that. I think I'm just trying to figure out how they think about it. But you can start seeing how you shift anywhere on the spectrum on any one of these things, and you have a separate category. You know, and then they define it. And then they try to live into it. Share a couple of thoughts from the young people. What's invalidating about gender, sexual identity? misgendered was very strong. That there's pressure to gender themselves, and that was not like pressured from my parents. Like that's pressured, like they feel it everywhere. Like I'm pressured to come up with a gender instead of just being okay with who I am, like whoever I am at this moment. Invalidating is not using preferred pronouns. You know, the trans young person was like, it's invalidating not knowing whether the person I just, like going into a crowd and meeting somebody, is that somebody who might want to kill me because I am, you know, trans at this point in my life. All right. Hard to be trans and trust me. Okay, so they even feel other people not being able to trust them because they don't know that they've made a clear choice, kind of thing. So those are some of the things that they say were invalidating to them. Things that were validating when they can actually find a community, and this is, for better or worse, they can find a community online. For any one of those 6 combinations, you can take any one of them and you can go find a community. And quite a lot of those communities are very accepting and tolerant of lots and lots of stuff, which most of you have been to, you know, like that's an emotional need, like to be accepted, to be validated for just who they are. Once they decide on pronouns, it's really validating to them to use the correct ones. Although I just heard a funny story the other day, like even in the schools, it's not like just 100% accepted, because one young person, like they know how to manipulate any system. So this one young person was like, what are your pronouns? He's like, pizzo and pizza. And then would get mad if you didn't use them correctly. Like they even know they're constructing some of this. Like they're just making this up. And so I am sure that young person was just a sarcastic, kind of smart, but he gets that it's not just a given, right? Like we can say whatever we want. So those that are honestly struggling with it aren't thinking that way, but even they know that this is somewhat, we're just figuring this out as we go. What are people ignorant about? What do you just wish more people would know? The ignoring and the sideways glances. So actually we're talking about the ones that are actually, you know, dealing with something. It felt a lot to me like how we thought about like physical difficulties in say the 80s or something like that, when somebody was in a wheelchair, you know, like do we just act like they're completely normal and like nothing's there? And you know, or do we make a big deal out of it? Do we, you know, try to accommodate them all the time? And those that are really struggling with it feel that kind of, that's what I got out of the conversation, is that people don't know how to react. And I'm like, they do understand why that's true, but you guys are welcome to ask questions about this if you've got some. I will do the best I can to.
Jason,
Yeah.
do you have encouragement for how to have a healthy conversation in our home about this topic?
So that's essentially why I'm giving you this. Okay. So one of the young people in this had, should I put this? Parents that had their own past, but then kind of came to faith before they had kids, and then went very strict. So they're very strict faith-based family with a young person who thinks they're bisexual, and with that, it like had chosen some other values along with some bad, unhealthy coping mechanisms. So it all just got kind of mixed up there, right? And really, the mother really did not agree with the whole gender issue. And at one point when I was working with the family, we sent this home with them, and the mom actually went through and checked their own, like, where are they on the continuum, and had that discussion with the young person, and could have a conversation about, yeah, I'm not as far to this extreme as you want to, the box you want to put me in. And I had questions when I was in my 20s, kind of thing. And so I think that's a starting point, to go through something like this. And and then figuring out and practicing just validating and making them feel worthy because they're alive, and somehow separating it from all these things that still impact you as a mother and a father. And I do think that's the one thing I get right, and why they keep talking to me, is I don't have to share my own opinions, and I have opinions for how I've chosen to live my own life, but I don't feel, and they get that I don't feel like putting them on. Now, don't get me wrong, they still get mad. I have a hard time with the pronouns, especially if you've changed them on me since I knew you. And I don't get that right. And so environment has something meaningful to do with it. So somehow, even though this isn't our issue, and I don't know that overall we condone or not condone any of it, but there are a lot of young people who are somewhere in this spectrum that feel comfortable, around here, and still dealing with their other stuff, which is really my next main point that I'm going to move to. But I think that's a fair question. I do think this, you go look up Genderbread, and he's got a whole packet of ways to think about it, and the kids know, and you'll know when you read it, there's always somewhat of an agenda behind some of it. Like it's not just purely like, let's all get along. It's suggesting that some of this is right or wrong or whatever. But it's still some of the best materials I've seen. So I'll go over that in a second. My biggest concern here, and again, I don't feel the need in other people's children to have a dog in the fight of what gender or sexuality you are, kind of thing. My biggest concern is that if you go back, like, they actually need to complete this whole list of tasks to be a young person and to become independent, all right? And if somehow that turns, and I actually asked the young people the question, and some will, like, what percentage of your mind was like wrapped around, and your energy wrapped around figuring this out, right? I got answers of 60 and 70%, and even though, like, having gone all the way through it, they're still at like 10%. And maybe that's more appropriate, but if an adolescent who needs to accomplish a ton of things has 50% of their energy and identity wrapped up in trying to figure out their gender or sexuality, there's just so many other things that they're not walking through and they're not figuring out. And so at the end of the day, that's where my biggest concern is just what are they missing out on, because some reason society has made this such a big deal right now. And I can watch, again, the young lady, like they were really struggling as a family, because the young person, we just talked about radical acceptance in group tonight, but they felt like they were fighting their parents over the issue all the time, which just made their position become stronger and stronger and more entrenched, and their parents' position. And so the ability to stop fighting it and doing a little bit of radical acceptance in that case like just ease so many tensions in that house, and let that young person blossom in different ways and stop using some of the unhealthy coping techniques to deal with the pain. And then, the parents would of course say, well, the pain is that that this isn't the way you were born. And the kid would say, well, no, the pain is you not accepting me for who I say I am. Like 6 of one, half dozen the other. I don't know, but I do know that the fighting each other was causing significant family. And it was really funny because you had both I was able to have both the young people and the parents go through values and everything. They're so close on so many things, but this issue was so big that it was impacting the whole, like whether they thought they were going to talk to each other for the future or not, right? And so that's my biggest concern, is that it just somehow, and in our language, it's like identity is developed by developing your value, or by finding things that matter to you. And if 50% of your energy is all trying to figure out gender and sexuality, you're not doing the range of things that should matter to you, because there should be more than that. I'm in awe of the number of 13-year-olds that I've got struggling. I'm like, there's so many other developmental tasks you need to be worried about. Not actually worried, but like just going through, and they're spending their energy on this one and missing out on. I mean, personal opinion, 13-year-olds shouldn't really be worrying about sex or who they're going out with. Like it just shouldn't have to be part of their day-to-day life. They should be worried about, am I in band? Am I making a sports team? Am I, I don't know what else they should be worried about, but it shouldn't have to be constantly who I'm attracted to, kind of thing. So that's my biggest concern, is that we find a way to have meaningful conversations around it. Essentially, to go all European, like on alcohol, like they just all drink all the time, and it's not nearly the issue that it is in America, where like kids are fighting it or hiding it or whatever. Like it's just not as big an issue, and they have less alcoholics and they have less problems with alcohol. And I think that's some of the same thing here, because even in this young person who would say they're bisexual and went through all kinds of things has landed on her longest relationship with a boy, like, and a boy who thinks they're a boy, just to go through the spectrum. And I can't say I experienced it, but there's tons of stories about people trying things in college, and then going on and living out what would normally look like a life. So at the end of the day, we get to this list, and this is when you can start, and you guys have this, you have this on page 2. I'm not even sure that's readable on there, but you have this on page 2 in your packets. What are the characteristic behaviors of people who have a sense of identity? So how can you tell if your young person has a sense of identity? This is they have a stable concept, a self-concept that doesn't easily change, are able to combine short-term goals with long-term plans, so it's not just this moment that matters, are less susceptible to the shifting whims of peer pressure. I do like the way these are phrased, less susceptible. It does not mean your kid can fight off, even with a good identity, every peer pressure. Tend to have reasonably high levels of self-acceptance, are able to make decisions without undue wavering and indecisiveness. You have no idea how many kids whose like main answer is I don't know. Like as soon as you've said that to me 3 times, I know you've got an identity issue of some kind. Whether it has anything to do with gender, sexuality, may not make it, but if you can't process 5 facts and come up with an opinion on it, you're struggling in your identity. Tend to be optimistic about themselves, other life in general, tend to believe that they are responsible for what happens to them, good or bad, are able to seek self-acceptance directly by being their own person, are able to be physically and emotionally close to another person without fearing loss of self, tend to be cognitively flexible, their sense of self does not depend on being right. Implicit attitude just means how are they thinking about themselves in their head. I am this kind of person. I am not perfect, but I'm still okay. I can accept your shortcomings because I can accept my own. All right. On the other hand, you've got the whole list of where is identity confusion going on. Tend to have unstable self-concept marked by ups and downs, the highs and lows. tend to set short-term goals, but have trouble establishing long-term goals. I mean, really, if you don't know who you're going to be in 3 months, how do you set a 3-month goal? I mean, much less, actually longer than that. Are more susceptible to the shifting whims of peer pressure influences, tend to have rather low levels of self-acceptance, are apt to have trouble making decisions, fearing that they will be wrong, tend to have a somewhat cynical attitude about themselves. Others in life generally tend to believe that what happens to them is largely out of their hands, a matter of fate or breaks, are inclined to seek self-acceptance indirectly by being what they believe others want them to be, are inclined to have trouble being physically and emotionally close to another person without being either too dependent or too separate or isolated, tend to be cognitively inflexible. Their sense of self resides heavily on being right. And their internal attitudes are, I am not sure who I am as a person. I should be much better more than I am. I have trouble accepting our shortcomings, just as I have trouble accepting that's supposed to be your shortcomings. My typing skills there. Accepting your shortcomings just as I have trouble accepting my own. Does that list kind of make sense? I love lists like this because they just help me see like where to put this problem. You can see ups and downs. You can see lots of these things, and you could categorize them in lots of different ways, which leads to lots of different ways to try to fix them. And if you think about it as an identity issue, then we work on identity kind of things. Are there any questions on that list? I'm going to close down with just going back to your question about what I think can be done. So again, this is the list of things that are needed to become independent or autonomous. They have to have physical activity. They have to have social interactions. They have to deal with things that might scare them. They have to take on responsibility. They need to interact with parents and other authority figures. They actually need to figure out how to deal with physical and emotional pain, figure out how to deal with conflict challenges and things that could bring vitality and value. So like literally, and that is the same exact list of a young person who's struggling, whether it's just straight up and down depression, anxiety, or if it's an identity issue. These are the things that get avoided. And it's literally all, so then if they're already getting avoided, and this is what I see in my room, if they're already getting avoided because of anxiety and depression, and you throw in they're spending 50% of their energy trying to figure out gender and sexuality issues, like, we have a hard time moving forward. And I think some of you experience that. And so when they're in ups and downs, this is like this green space is when healthy skill development, when they can go through those tasks. So if they're triggering themselves and they're in hyperarousal fight or flight mechanism, they're not working on these things. And if they're dysregulated in the hypoarousal, they're freezing, they're numb, they're dissociating kind of thing, then they're still not in that window of tolerance where they can actually work on things. And so I would say my very abstract answer to your question is, how do we keep that window of tolerance in the environment around the family such a place that it's okay to be learning and practicing other skills? But that's hard when, as a family, you have this set of values and your young person seems to be trying on a completely different set of values that don't make sense, because it leads to both sides being at one end or the other and not in a window of tolerance. So how do you do that? I think all of you have been given. So the next page is more about the valuer, kind of reminding you about the valuer, because again, the valuer, as far as I'm concerned, helps them form an identity. And having an identity means you are able to control your behavior in different situations and settings. And so how do you build up that valuer? The last page, I really think it comes down to talking about those values. And all those conversation cards and all the questions you've got in your packet are stimulating the valuer in your young person if you can actually have a conversation around it. If anybody's lost their conversation cards and wants a set, I will get them another set. I probably have a couple sets in here, who knows. But you have all the questions. So to go back to the question, which is a really fair question, how do we, like, just talking about anything that matters makes it safer to talk about the things that really matter to them. And so some of these are more safe than going straight into gender sexuality conversations. And you can build a pattern of having a meaningful conversation without them feeling judged and not accepted and that kind of thing. I think that's, I obviously think bold is the process on both sides of the equation, parents and young people, to get themselves in a place where that window of tolerance is open enough for conversation and dealing with things. So that's all I got.
Good, thank you.
Questions, answers. Does any of that make sense? Was that helpful in thinking about your young person? And gender sexuality is not the only way people get to identity problems. I just flat out being raped or having significant trauma when you're younger can make the whole world unsafe, which is kind of where I started with at the beginning with that COVID list. There are any things that have happened, divorce, big issues, I mean, even moves, and I don't want to say all of these are clinically significant, but my moves, my parents moved us, I think I was at 5 or 6 different locations before I was 5. You know, I mean, it was just like my stability was my parents' house. You know, differently than like this town or something like that. Then they moved me right before junior high, and I actually attached and still have friends from the school I went to from 7th grade through my sophomore year. They moved me after my sophomore year. I knew I was going on to college. What's the point of attaching to these people? I mean, I can remember having that thought. I still enjoyed my junior and senior years, but I'm not nearly as attached to that town and that locale, you know, purely for identity issue kind of thing. So, any questions, thoughts on that particular thing? Otherwise, we'll kind of go around the horn.